Hi my dear friends, my name is Hussein Mashayikhi and we are back with another session from our Unreal Engine course. In the previous session we learned how to navigate through the scene, move the camera, but in this one we're going to learn how to manage our objects and move them about. So we learned about a lot of the panels that you are seeing in our viewport right now, and we learned how to dock them and use a lot of the options inside those panels. In this one we're not gonna need them, so I'm gonna close them for a second so that our viewport is kind of less crowded. We're going to learn how to select our objects with these buttons and move them around, so stay tuned. All right, the first button that you see right now with the mouse click icon is for selecting an object. For example, I'm selecting these windows right now and it simply selects them. Let me just put one detail panel on the right. So each object that I select, the relevant details would just pop up in the right panel, as you can see. So I selected this tree, and if I want to select more items, I can't just drag a window. I have to hold Control down on my keyboard and select on the second item that I want to select. So as you can see, by holding Control down and selecting these items, I've selected pretty much everything. Okay, now if I wanted to use click and drag to select all of the items, I needed to go to the top view and just select everything like so. Okay, this would be another way of selecting a number of objects or items that you want. So you go to the top view, for example, or any view for that matter, and then use that with click and drag. All right, let's go to the second button that we have up there. This one is select and translate. So when I click on this, select and translate, I can select an object and move it as well. And the shortcut for it is W. So the shortcut for the previous select button was Q. For this one is W. So if I select this item with select and translate, I can move it on this axis as well. Same with the roof. And so whenever I want to move something, this would be a good button to use. And this 3D gizmo that you see is very useful. You can just move something on one axis, or if you go to the middle part of it, you can just move it in any axis that you want simultaneously. So you can move it up, down, left, right, and it's going to be very handy. And as we are moving this piece, look at the location details. These numbers change. So I'm just moving it on this axis, and you can see that the numbers for that axis is going to change. Okay, so to move that object, I can also change these numbers. So for example, if I have a certain number in mind in terms of the location of a certain object, I can just change that number to the value that I want on any axis that I want. Okay, so this is gonna be useful in some cases as well. Like I said in the previous session, select an object and press F on your keyboard so that you zoom in on it, and then if you want to move it around, you have this button here. All right, the next button that we have here is select and rotate. So if I select an item or object with this button, I can rotate it. The shortcut for this one is E. So I can just push E on my keyboard, select an object like this floor or a window or anything, and just rotate it with the mouse button. And I can just use these numbers for rotation as well, like we used to for location. So again, very similar. This time we're just rotating the objects that we have. So these are not very complicated tools, and if you've been working with 3D software for some time, you probably know about them, and they are very easy to work with. So again, this is how rotation works. The next button that we have here is select and scale. The shortcut for this one is R, and usually in most 3D programs we have one shortcut for all of these controls, but here we have separate shortcuts. So if you select an object and use the mouse, you can just scale it into any scale that you like or any size that you like. For example, look at this tree. I select it and press R on my keyboard, and I can just change the scale. I can make it smaller or bigger by moving the mouse to the left and right. And something else that you can do if you want to scale your object on a certain axis, make sure to use the gizmo right. So you can scale something on a certain axis, or if you go to the middle cube, you can just scale the whole object without any deformation with the original proportions. And again, like the previous controls, we can just use the scale numbers and scale our object to our desire with these numbers. Okay, so again, a very useful tool. We can just manipulate these numbers, put in certain values that we have received before, and scale our objects. And you can use this lock for keeping proportions. So if you unlock it, you can just change the scale on one axis. If you lock it, when you change the scale, the proportion is going to be kept intact. All right, so we learned about select, move, rotate, and scale buttons. Let's jump ahead to these snap buttons. For example, the first one is put on 10. And if I move this tree, for example, on this axis, it moves in 10 unit increments. To show you this better, let me just make a simple shape, for example, a cube, put it here. All right, let me just move it a little bit off the ground. Now, if I want to move this lower a little bit, it just snaps on the ground. Okay, so this is because of this snap button which is enabled, and if I disable it, I can just move it up and high without any snap movements. And I can just change the numbers here. If I put this in 100, as I move it up or down, it's gonna jump like bigger with like 100 unit increments. I think you can easily see it happening. Okay. The same concept of snap increment movements applies to rotation as well. So if I try to rotate it, you can see that it rotates in 10 unit increments. I can just turn it off. Now it just does it smoothly, a smooth rotation. I can put it on a higher number, for example, 90. See, it's gonna be obvious this time. So if I attempt to rotate it, let me just make it a rectangle there. So 90 degrees rotation. All right, so we have the same thing for a scale as well. The next button, which is been put on 0.25. And if I want to make this cube bigger or smaller, it happens in that increment. Now, if I turn it off, you can see that it gradually gets smaller or bigger. And again, I can make this, for example, put it on 1. And this time you can just see everything more clearly. It's more exaggerated. So a lot bigger or a lot smaller. All right, now these tools are not that complicated, but they are very useful. For example, we use these tools for our objects, and also we use them for our directional light or the sun. We can just move the sun or directional light. We can change the rotation or the angle. And it's just almost routine, so make sure to get the hang of these buttons and get comfortable working with them, because they're gonna come in handy real soon. All right, we have two other buttons here that is gonna change the gizmo for you. To show you how that works, let me just make this cube a little bit bigger, change the scale. All right, I'm going to rotate and move it as well. Okay, and I'm gonna add another cube on top of it somewhere here. Okay, let me just rotate this too, place it somewhere here. All right, take a look at the cube's gizmo. If I want to move this in this direction, the gizmo is not put in the right direction for me, and it's not, possible. But if I click on this button, the gizmo changes direction like so, and this time I easily move it in that direction that I had initially intended to. So let me just pan it back. Now I want to move the cube in this angle. Okay, so it's gonna be rather difficult if I want to keep the angle, preserve the angle, but as you can see, it's difficult. But if I click on this button, the gizmo is gonna change and this way I can just preserve the angle and do it a lot easier. So in other words, right now the gizmo is in the world mode, but when I change it into the local mode, the gizmo changes based on the location, rotation, and the scale of that object. Alright, the button that we have next to this one is just going to put our object on a surface. So let me show you a little demonstration. So I delete this cube. Let me just try to create another one, move it, change the scale. Alright, now this button is called surface snapping, and when I enable it, when I move an object near a surface, that object rotates automatically and changes its direction. See? Compare the cube when it's on the floor to when it's near this big rectangle. So the direction of the object changes automatically. Alright, we have another option on the same button, which is called, let me see, surface offset. So whatever number I put here is going to be the distance that my object keeps from surfaces. For example, right now it's on 100. Okay, and if I want to put this on this edge, see, I have 100 units of distance, which is the offset that we set from that surface. Alright, we have another option which is called rotate to surface normal. And it's basically when we move that object towards the surface, it's not going to change direction. So if we uncheck it, see, it's near the surface. It has kept the distance, but it's not going to be rotated. Let me just change this surface offset, put it back to 0. See, we're not going to have any rotation when we move the cube towards different surfaces. Okay, now let me just check this again. See, we have the rotation now. Alright, so we learned how to use this button as well, with rotation, without rotation, with offset distance, and so let's talk about copying objects. So let me just delete these for a second, and I'm gonna make another cube, change the size and the scale. Okay, alright, now we want to make multiple copies of this cube. Sorry, let me just close this. And we want the copies to look like hands of a clock. Okay, so we want them to be put in those types of directions. Now, to do that very easily and handily, I want to use the gizmo, and I want to move the gizmo so that I can do it more easily. To do that, you gotta select the gizmo with the mouse scroller and keep holding the scroller and move the gizmo down or up. Okay, now I want to put it here, for example. The problem is if I do a left click anywhere on the screen, the gizmo is going to change back to its original place. So I put it back there. The trick is, instead of doing a left click, right click on the object. Okay, let me just do it again. Put it here, right click. And from this list, choose pivot and set as pivot offset. Okay, so select this option. So now the pivot is gonna stay there after I click anywhere on the screen. I can again change the pivot's location. For example, I put it there, go to pivot, set as pivot offset. So that object's pivot is gonna be there, all right? Okay, so let's go as planned. Let's just move the pivot to a place that is going to be handy for us. Okay, I'm gonna select it with the mouse scroller, put it down here. Right click, pivot, set as pivot offset. Now to make copies, I hold down Alt on my keyboard, and with that rotation button that we talked about here, I can make multiple copies. All right, I'm gonna do the same thing. The trick is each time to just release the Alt key for a second and then press and hold it. So that's gonna be useful. I can do the same thing with the move button. See, I make new copies and move them instead of rotating them. And so those buttons that we learned about are very handy here. The only problem is that we cannot do the same thing with the scale. So holding down Alt key and making copies with the scale is not going to work like the two previous buttons. Okay, next we're going to learn how to group stuff. So I select these 3 cubes and press Ctrl and G on my keyboard, and now they are in a group. And if I move them, they move together. Okay, so if I click on one, all of them will be selected. Now to ungroup these objects, we can just right click on them, go to groups and select ungroup. And just like that, they are not in a group anymore. Now, if we want to have a certain object glued to a place in our scene and not be moved at all, we can right click on it, go to transform and lock it, lock actor movement. If we select this option, this object is not going to move and it's gonna keep its location. So to reverse that, we gotta right click on it again, go to transform and uncheck lock actor movement. Okay, now we can just move it again. We can also move our objects using coordinates. So for example, this one, I'm gonna right click on it, go to transform and select delta transform. Okay, and now I can just put in the numbers that I want. For example, on the x-axis, I can just put 2000 or 200 and just move it on that axis. We can also mirror our objects. If we go to transform and use mirror x, y, or z, we can just mirror it relative to this selected axis. Okay. Now using this right click menu, you can just do some copy pasting as well. For example, if you go to edit and select copy, okay, you've made a copy of this object, you can move over there and go to edit and select paste, and now you can just paste it. And you can do this again multiple times. Okay, and we can just do the same thing with cut. Go to edit and select cut and paste it with Ctrl V. So the shortcuts Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and Ctrl X work here too. So with this tree, I can just use these shortcuts to make a couple more. So with Ctrl V, I put one here, and each time I press Ctrl V, a copy is gonna be put on the original tree, and I can just drag it. Okay. Alright, another thing that we usually do is to hide objects. So if we go to visibility and choose hide selected for an object, we can hide it. The shortcut for this one, which is H, is going to be very useful. So I'm going to hide these trees, and let me just go to the building, maybe the floor, okay, and the walls. So each time I select an object and press H on my keyboard, I can hide it, and to unhide everything in my scene, I can simply press Ctrl and H. So let's go back to the right click menu, go to visibility. We talked about hide selected. We talked about show all actors, which was Ctrl H. Now we have this other one, show only selected. So let me show you what this does. So if I, for example, select this tree and go to visibility, select show only selected, we only see this tree. And because we momentarily lose light and everything, it's better to put this on lit. Okay, and we talked about this in the previous session. And after you are done working on this tree, you can just press Ctrl and H like we said and unhide everything. Now let me just hide my directional light for you. See, we have no lights. And to make it come back, just simply press Ctrl and H. Alright, so among these visibility options, the ones that we talked about are very useful, and so make a mental note of them and learn these at least: hide selected, show only selected, and show all actors. Alright. Now, before I wrap this session up, let me just tell you something. If I select this tree and a couple of these cubes, if you go to the details, you can see that we have 3 objects selected. And similarly, if I select a number of, for example, different materials, for example, this cube, one of these cubes, let me just select this and the floor. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that the floor and one of these cubes is selected. In the details panel under materials, we can see that we have 2 materials selected, and if I click on it, we can see it in details. So, and later on, when we learn more about materials, we can just change these materials from this list. Okay, and again, this is going to come in handy later on when we are working with different materials in our scene. So in this session, we learned how to move and rotate and select the objects in our scene. We learned how to make copies of them, and move the copies, rotate the copies, and how to move and offset the pivot gizmo, which is again another useful tool. And a very common use case for this pivot offset is when you try to import some objects into Unreal Engine, and sometimes you can't just find a pivot, or it's not where you expect it to be. For example, this one, if the pivot is there, it's not going to be as easy to move it. So knowing how to work with the pivot gizmo and how to offset it is very useful. All right, now we have reached the end of this session. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you are practicing as well. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to learn more about post-processing and also how to import our objects from other 3D programs such as 3ds Max, SketchUp, and Revit. So stay tuned for those, and I'll see you in the next one.